Hi everybody, I'm Hamish Oakley-Browne. We're here in Titai Tokoro in Whangarei, where I practice as an artist. We're sitting in the beautiful Quarry Gardens, where there's an art centre. And at the back of the art centre is a print studio called Te Kowhai Print Trust, which is an open access print studio, and this is where I practice from. I manage the print studio, but also utilise the resources here, the facilities, for my print practice. That brings me to discussion about printmaking and why printmaking is important, I believe, for my practice, but an important medium through which to communicate the ideas that I'm trying to communicate as an artist. I refer to myself as a research artist because my arts practice is really founded in the research, the topics of interest that I come across, that I stumble across. I base a body of research, and in that body of research I'm hoping for something to emerge. I guess when talking about printmaking historically, I like to, go way back to where it was founded and where it really started, and in that sort of understanding, my arts practice, I want to connect with that heritage, that lineage that goes all the way back to the 1500s, to when engraving became printmaking, to when etching became printmaking, to where woodcut was invented as a way of transmitting artworks and information. And I really I want to be connected to that lineage, because when I feel connected to that lineage, I feel like my artwork has a certain authenticity sitting inside that lineage, but also I believe that that lineage is really rich. It's a rich garden of resource in which I can build my practice on, and it's like that is the if we're going to use the sort of the topics around the symposium, it's kind of the fertilizer for which my arts practice grows out of. And I'm looking back to those original artists who found print to be a way of disseminating not only their artworks but also disseminating ideas. And I'm looking back to Jura and the Italians, and understanding how, especially like what I refer to as the Ninja Turtles, Donatello and Michelangelo, and how print was also part of their practice. They're well known as painters, but also when we start to look back in the sort of the history of Western print, we see how many, if not all, the artists engaged in some kind of printmaking and utilized print not only as a vehicle to make multiples of their work or to change the way they approach their work, but also prints were found in the collection of all the masters. And what we understand now is how holding collections of prints influenced the way each of the people practiced. And I guess I want to be connected to that idea that and understanding how my practice is influenced by that heritage of print. It also helps me because it forms the basis of some of the themes that I wish to discuss in my practice. And the idea of alternative realities, I think, really is at the cornerstone of my practice, where whether I'm using the idea of a folk or a fairy tale, or I'm using sort of more in-depth analysis of dreams or dream theory, or ideas that psychologists have presented about how we are as humans, these are the things that I'm kind of researching and bringing together in a kind of a mishmash in the hope that something really interesting grows out of that. The idea that we're influenced by an artwork across time, across space, and across themes is a really interesting idea for me, and also about our conscious states, how we perceive and experience the world. I think one of the sort of my earliest memories of research was being in a in a public library, and a book popped out off the shelf that caught my eye straight away, and it was called Trance, Healing and Hallucination, and was an old kind of academic document, research study that some people had done studying different states of reality. And it's from like whirling dervishes or Christian communities and or other cultures that utilized dance, movement, or different psychological states in the way they kind of practiced their culture or perceived reality. And I always look back to that book as a sort of founding document to my approach to my arts practice, is that I am trying to understand things about the world. I'm trying to understand things about the way we work as humans. And when I see a book on the shelf where something pops out to me, I grab that thing and I trust my intuition that that thing is going to be lead me somewhere. The author Patti Smith sort of has a creative practice or a creative technique that I love to kind of emulate, and she might pick up on the smallest object or idea that another artist or writer has presented and take an element of that and go and find out about it. And I think I follow a similar practice. So something that interests me will pique my interest, and I can go along, I can follow that line. And it doesn't have to be entirely linear, my approach to it. It can be any small element of that line that becomes important. And each of those things, like plants a little seed. And I'm hoping that as I move across my research, I gather enough data and information that something's just sort of intuitively pops out of that process. And I have to trust that in some way that the elements that pop up are important to make art out of. And sometimes it's kind of like a reverse thing where what I'm doing becomes obvious later in a kind of weird reversal. How this applies to printmaking is, I think, printmaking's rich heritage, its association with publication, its association with the print industry, the dissemination of ideas. I think that process of print, the way it has sat across history, is in many ways the same process that I utilize to make works of art. In my current research that really pertains to this Awhi Incubator project that many artists in the local area are currently involved in, is last summer I became directly interested. I mean, as a printmaker, we're interested in paper. You know, paper, I don't think there's a printmaker around that hasn't developed a deep love and understanding for paper. And the same thing happened for me. The way I understood the sort of the history of paper became part of my practice. I wanted the substrate, the paper I'm using in my practice, to tell a story. And many of the most famous papers made in the world today and across history have the most fabulous stories attached to them. And I wanted to include those things. I felt like the integrity of my work was also, the stories that were told in my work were also told by the substrate in which I was using to print on paper. And the stories helped reinforce the work, and I kind of embarked on an idea that I'd learn more about the history of the fibres that were utilised in paper making, and in the hope that the understanding of that would bring me to this idea that I could use in my current work. So what happened was, as I looked at the history of paper, and we now know that paper probably came from the Middle East across the Silk Road and into Europe, and the different kinds of techniques and paper making traditions developed right across that part of the world, out of China, and really changed the way stuff was transported, especially art and printmaking. And what I really discovered was that paper was made from a number of basic components, natural fibres. In the East, in China, there's a tradition of rice paper made by the fibres of rice grass, and then in Japan, mulberry and the kozo paper making tradition started. In the West, we had linen and cotton became the sort of two basic natural fibres that paper was made from. What I understood then was that linen was kind of the high-end paper. When they started making linen paper, what they found is that it lasted for a very long time. They could make it strong and durable and kind of pH neutral, so it could last for a significant period of time. And this kind of brought me along to a very local story, which is in the history of Aotearoa and the history of flax here, because linen we know is made from a European flax fibre, which differs. We call our native harakiki flax, we call it flax too, but it's actually quite a significantly different plant. What it does have in common with linen is it has a long fibre that in some ways resembles linen. It's a much rougher fibre and traditionally was used by Māori in weaving practices. And paper making wasn't a tradition of the locals, but when colonisation occurred in the country, European traders soon realised that the flax fibre from Aotearoa was really great in the same ways that linen was important in Europe. And the trade in flax, mostly for rope, sails and sacking, occurred. But then a little interesting side story is that paper making was developed because the local flax fibre was seen as a similar alternative to linen. What I really liked is that at some point there was talk that New Zealand, let's call it New Zealand linen or harakiki paper, was earmarked as a really high quality paper that could be used in currency. And prior to the New Zealand wars, which kind of destabilised New Zealand economy, this enterprise was really a growing part of the New Zealand trading community. So I felt like those kind of stories about the New Zealand harakiki flax plant really lent weight to a series of work that I was making around reinterpretation of New Zealand history. And so I started making my own flax paper. I spent the summer experimenting with different ways to approach removing, the binding elements in the flax and bringing out the fibers. And I made traditional molds and decals to make really oversized large sheets of harakiki paper that I felt like really told the story of this colonization of our country and the stories that were involved, in that process of colonization, and used it as the substrate. And I guess where I'm going with this is to talk about how I think it's important for my arts practice that when I approach something, I'm trying to get a really holistic take on how I can present the idea, that the idea is presented in a holistic fashion as I can, and the more elements that I bring in that tell sides of the story otherwise untold, creates a depth and richness in the work I'm producing. So this kind of brings me, we're making this publication as part of this Awhi World Incubator series, and sort of brings me to the piece of work that I've submitted for this publication and how I came across it. Differs a bit from the fibre story, which I just wanted to include because it was an important part of some of the things that we discussed in Awhi Incubator, which is, what other elements can you use to print on that also tell a story, which include things like plastics and natural products like kombucha leather. And led me down a little bit of a rabbit hole about mushroom paper. However, I'm just going to kind of forward to talk a little bit about the piece that I submitted for the publication, which is another sort of a pet love of mine, which is the dream theory. And the role of kind of like the alternative reality of dream. I really enjoyed Carl Jung's Red Book and his take on what he believes is going on in dreams. And I often utilize that, his idea, and bringing things from, harvesting ideas from my dreams to build a kind of alternative reality inside the real world that also aligns with some of my investigations. And the piece I submitted tells a little story about Katherine Mansfield and her last days. And she's a New Zealand author, renowned kind of like an angel of New Zealand literature. However, there's a kind of a darker story that exists around the final days of her life. She passed away with tuberculosis. And the way I kind of weaved a bunch of stories into that piece. At the time, this space here that we were sitting in was filled with old relics. And I was working with the photographer, cleaning up the space. What we found is, and I love to call them like heirloom treasures, this space was completely packed with 30 years of junk. And I kind of like to view it as an overgrown garden. And I came in here with Ellie Smith, and we were kind of weeding through the garden because there was many objects here I didn't understand the use of. they were photography objects, or they were really old kind of print heritage objects that I didn't really know what the use is, and I'm really hesitant to throw anything out. So we were sorting through some stuff, and we found a box of old glass gelatin negatives, which we could see were images of people from, and all it had on the side of the box was circa 1901. So early New Zealand photographs. And Ellie went back and developed the photographs, and inside that little suite of slides were some really little interesting slices of unknown New Zealand history. And I felt like I could retell the stories of these people. And so I created this kind of a mesh of an alternative reality where I'm saying these people existed inside of perhaps the last days of Katherine Mansfield. And I reimagined the lives of these people, along with my research into the sort of dark last hours of the author, and I reimagined a story, a kind of sinister noir crime novel, where I'm kind of posing a question or encouraging people to perhaps look deeper into what really happened there. And I don't even know if he's Russian, but he was sometimes called Russian, but definitely came out of that that school of Rasputin-like Russian, let's call them gurus. He wrote many books on philosophy. His name was G.I. Gurdjieff, and I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, but he had many, and he had this kind of a practice which he called waking up, because he believed most people were still asleep. And it's a practice loosely based in that kind of Hindu idea, where, it's a little bit of Hindu, it's a little bit of dervish, spinning dervish, it's a little bit of kind of Russian occult practice, where he's meshed in this idea, and he was a cult leader. And many Europeans went to his institute in Fontainebleau in France. And Katherine Mansfield actually went there in her last days, hoping to receive some kind of healing from him. And the story, often told is that she just passed away from the tuberculosis that she currently had, but there's also an alternative story that's told in the less reputable media, say, that she was utilizing some of his unusual practices to try and heal herself from tuberculosis. And it was at his chateau in France that she passed away under mysterious circumstances, let's say. In my reality, it's a murder mystery. So he's this crazy Russian hypnotist. One of my favourite stories of his is he was broke and in in the Far East there somewhere, and he used a bird trap to capture 20 or 30 sparrows, which he took home and painted bright colours, and went back down to the market and sold them expensively as canaries, and took the money to live off, and then and the first rains came and he was chased out of town by the locals as the colours disappeared from the canaries. So part charlatan, and I guess that's the same with many gurus, they're part charlatan and part wise man, and I kind of like that that idea that there's really truth mixed in with a lot of falsehoods there. To step warily, but I also love the idea of bringing that into my work, you know, some kind of, there's a mystery element. There's something going on that's a little sinister behind the scenes, but also might lead you somewhere really interesting. Unusual character and unusual end to her life. One of the stories I heard was that he said the exhalations of bovines will cure her tuberculosis, and she had to sleep in the attic above the barn where the cows slept, and that's where she passed away. I thought that that's unusual. But that was the kind of man. What's it called? The Institute for the Harmonious Growth of Man or something was the name of his institute. But he convinced many people that, and still has many followers around the world, that a bunch of sort of dancing and moving practices will bring you to enlightenment. But what he called waking up. In summary, my practice is bound in the tradition of printmaking across history. That I love to include as many elements to the story that can get told, utilizing the paper or the substrate that I'm printing on, using the medium that I choose to print on, whether it's woodcut or dry point etching or screen print, that all those elements tell a story. That the stories I like to tell are an amalgam of my research and intuitive choices in how I approach things that spring out and interest me. That in many ways I'm trying to subvert my logical thinking process into a dream state to allow me to join things together that I would maybe reject with a more logical understanding. That being open in my own self, understanding how I function, means that I can more readily, make sure the inner critic is at bay. Make sure the individual inside of me that's saying, "Well, that doesn't make sense," is kept quiet to allow something else to come through that's really kind of growing out of all these different elements that I'm looking at and researching, whether it's the history of print, the history of papermaking, the history of dreams, dream theory, or, and these, I guess, are the seeds that I'm planting, and hoping that, in closing my eyes, that an idea, an image pops forth that I can then, channel through the medium of printmaking to make a final piece. That's the basis of what I'm, my creative practice.